In a quiet neighborhood where time seems to stand still, Edith, an elderly widow, tends to her beloved rose garden until a new family moves in next door. But something about their arrival stirs an uneasy feeling in her. When she meets Rachel, a young mother, and her two frightened daughters, Edith senses a darkness lurking beneath the surface. As Edith becomes involved, she uncovers a secret that will change all their lives forever. Will Edith have the courage to face the danger that threatens them all? If you're ready for a story of bravery, community, and finding strength when it's needed most, hit that subscribe button and comment below with your thoughts as the story unfolds. Make sure to stay with us to find out how one woman's quiet life turns into a fight for survival and hope. Edith Carter's days had become as predictable as the steady ticking of the clock that hung on the kitchen wall. Every morning at precisely 700 a.m., she would rise from bed, her joints protesting the motion, and shuffle into the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. The aroma of fresh coffee always filled the small, neatly kept home, her one indulgence since her husband Richard had passed away 5 years ago. Edith was now 82, but in her heart she still felt much younger, like a woman in her 50s, just waiting for Richard to walk through the front door with a bouquet of wildflowers, as he had done so often when they were younger. But those days were gone, and the house was quiet now. Too quiet, she often thought. The silence was both her comfort and her curse. It wrapped around her like an old quilt, warm and familiar, but sometimes suffocating. Edith's routine had become her way of coping with the loneliness that had settled into her bones. After coffee, she would sit in her favorite chair by the window, sipping slowly as she watched the world outside. The world outside had changed. Cedar Street, once a lively suburban haven filled with the sounds of children laughing and neighbors chatting, had grown silent over the years. The young families who once filled the street had moved away, and the homes had either been sold to strangers or left vacant, their yards overgrown with weeds. Edith remembered a time when every house had a family, a story, and the street had felt like a living thing, pulsing with life and connection. She had been a part of that world, back when she and Richard had first moved into their little house, newlyweds with dreams of a long life together. Now the houses stood in eerie silence. The once pristine lawns were neglected, the fences in disrepair. The children's laughter, once a constant sound on summer days, had faded into distant memory. Even the neighborhood barbecues, where the smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs had filled the air, had become a thing of the past. Edith had been one of the last to hold out, determined to stay in the home she had built with Richard. She couldn't imagine leaving, even though her nieces and nephews had urged her to move closer to family. Edith sighed as she set her coffee cup down on the small round table beside her chair. She rose slowly, her stiff joints protesting with every step, and made her way to the garden. The garden was where she felt closest to Richard. He had loved this garden. Together they planted every rose bush, every row of marigolds, every patch of daisies. She could almost hear his voice as she worked, giving her gentle advice on how to prune the roses just right, or reminding her to water the petunias in the early morning when the sun was still soft and low in the sky. The weathered, red-handled pruning shears felt familiar in Edith's grip, and as she knelt by the roses, she lost herself in the rhythm of her work. The garden had always been her therapy, her way of finding peace in the midst of grief. She could spend hours out here, tending to the flowers, weeding the beds, and watering the delicate plants. Each bloom was like a memory of happier times, a reminder of days when Richard had been beside her, his laugh echoing across the yard as he teased her about being a rose whisperer. But those days were gone, and with them had gone the laughter, the companionship, and the sense of belonging. The street was different now, filled with strangers, or worse, nobody at all. She wasn't sure which was lonelier, the absence of people, or the presence of those who didn't care to know her. As Edith trimmed the rose bushes, she glanced up and down the street, noting the silence. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment she imagined she could hear the ghostly echoes of the past children riding their bikes, neighbors calling out friendly greetings, the sizzling of burgers on a grill. But it was only her imagination, playing tricks on her as it so often did. She wiped her brow with the back of her gloved hand and stood slowly, surveying her work with satisfaction. The roses looked beautiful, their soft petals glistening in the sunlight. But the emptiness of the street weighed heavily on her heart. Without Richard, and without the vibrant life that had once surrounded her, the house and the garden felt like relics of a bygone era. "I need to get out more," Edith muttered to herself as she straightened her back, wincing slightly at the ache in her knees. "Maybe I'll go into town later, get some groceries." But even as she said it, she knew she probably wouldn't. Going into town meant encountering people, and Edith had grown used to her solitude. She wasn't sure she wanted to break the fragile peace she had built around herself. It was easier to stay home, where everything was familiar, where the memories of Richard and the life they had shared were still strong. As Edith gathered her tools and turned to head back inside, a low rumble broke the stillness of the morning. She paused, glancing down the street. A large moving truck was slowly making its way toward the house next door, the one that had been vacant for nearly 2 years. Edith's heart gave a small flutter of excitement. It had been so long since anyone had moved into Cedar Street, and she had almost given up hope that the house would ever be occupied again. She stood in her garden, watching as the truck came to a stop in front of the old house. The truck's brakes squealed softly as it settled into place, and Edith craned her neck to get a better view. Who were these new people? A family? A couple? The thought of new neighbors stirred something in Edith. Hope, maybe. Hope that the street might come alive again, that there might be voices, laughter, and the possibility of friendship. As she watched, the passenger door of the truck swung open and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her early 30s, with dark skin that gleamed in the sunlight. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress that fluttered around her knees as she moved, and Edith could see a mixture of emotions on her face. Excitement, apprehension, maybe even exhaustion. The woman stood by the truck for a moment, taking in her surroundings. She glanced toward Edith's house, but didn't seem to notice her standing in the garden. After a brief pause, the woman reached into the truck and helped 2 little girls climb down from the passenger seat. They were small, no more than 6 or 7 years old, and identical in appearance, with curly hair tied up in matching pigtails. The girls clung to their mother, their wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar neighborhood. Edith's heart warmed at the sight of them. Children! It had been so long since there had been children on Cedar Street. She couldn't help but smile at the thought of hearing the sound of their laughter, the patter of small feet running up and down the sidewalk. Maybe this family would bring life back to the street, something it had desperately needed for years. As the woman and her daughters made their way to the front of the house, the driver's side door of the truck opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a stern expression. His presence immediately shifted the energy of the scene. While the woman and the girls seemed tentative, this man exuded a quiet authority that made Edith uneasy. He stretched his arms and surveyed the house with a critical eye. There was something about the way he moved that made Edith pause. He wasn't smiling, wasn't engaging with the woman or the girls. Instead, he seemed distant, cold even. Edith's brow furrowed as she watched him, trying to read his expression. Was he their father, husband? Something about the way the woman glanced at him, quickly, almost nervously, made Edith wonder. The man approached the front door of the house, his steps purposeful and brisk. He unlocked the door, holding it open for the woman and the girls, but he didn't speak to them. The woman ushered the girls inside, giving one last glance around the neighborhood before disappearing into the house. Edith stood in her garden, watching the scene unfold, her curiosity piqued. The man was last to enter, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. And then silence. For a long moment, Edith remained where she was, her hands resting on the handle of her pruning shears. The excitement she had felt just moments ago was tinged with something else, an unease that she couldn't quite place. There was something about the man's demeanor that unsettled her. He didn't seem warm or welcoming. In fact, the entire family seemed tense, as though there was more beneath the surface than what she could see. "Don't be silly," Edith muttered to herself as she headed back toward her own house. "They're probably just tired from the move. It's stressful after all." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. But what could she do? She was just an old woman watching from the sidelines. Maybe, she thought, she could bake them a cake and introduce herself. That was the neighborly thing to do. It would give her a chance to meet them properly, to see if her worries were unfounded. Yes, she decided. Tomorrow, she will bake a cake. The next morning, Edith woke with a sense of purpose. She had decided the night before to welcome her new neighbors properly, and she knew exactly how to do it. Edith had always prided herself on her baking, and her lemon pound cake was something of a legend among the old neighbors. It was a recipe her mother had passed down to her, and over the years, Edith had perfected it to the point where no one could resist a second slice. She spent the morning gathering the ingredients, her movements slow but steady. The familiar routine of baking helped calm her nerves, even as her thoughts continued to circle around the new family next door. She couldn't quite explain it, but the more she thought about the man, the way he had carried himself, the coldness in his eyes, the more unsettled she felt. She tried to push those feelings aside as she mixed the batter, focusing instead on the excitement of meeting her new neighbors. By the time the cake was out of the oven and cooling on the counter, Edith had tidied herself up, slipping on her favorite cardigan and tying a neat bow around the cake box. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, looking out the window toward the house next door. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of movement. It struck Edith as odd that there hadn't been any activity in the yard since the family had arrived. Usually, when people moved in, there was a flurry of unpacking, organizing, and getting settled. But the house remained eerily quiet, as if the family had retreated inside and shut themselves off from the world. Determined to make a good first impression, Edith made her way to the front door, carefully balancing the cake box in her hands. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest, and walked across the lawn to the house next door. When she reached the porch, she hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house, and Edith waited, her heart beating a little faster than usual. A long moment passed, and just as she was beginning to wonder if anyone was home, the door opened. The man Derek, she would later learn, stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the entrance. He looked down at her with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unkind, just neutral. His eyes, however, were sharp, as if he were sizing her up. "Hello," Edith began, her voice bright and cheerful. "I'm Edith Carter, your neighbor from next door. I thought I'd bring you a little something to welcome you to the neighborhood." She held out the cake, her smile widening as she hoped to soften his stern demeanor. But Derek didn't smile. He glanced down at the cake and then back at Edith, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and gruff. He reached out to take the cake, but he didn't move to invite her in or offer any pleasantries. Edith cleared her throat, trying to fill the awkward silence. "It's a lemon pound cake," she explained. "My own recipe. I hope you and your family enjoy it." Derek nodded but said nothing. He stood there for a moment, holding the cake box in one hand, his other hand resting on the doorframe. Edith waited, hoping he might introduce himself, or perhaps call for the woman or the girls to come say hello, but he did neither. "Is your wife around?" Edith asked, trying to sound casual. "I'd love to meet her and the little ones." Derek's jaw tightened slightly, and his eyes flickered with something annoyance, perhaps. "She's resting," he said, his tone clipped. "And the kids are busy." Edith felt her stomach drop slightly. The coldness in his voice was unmistakable now, and she could sense that he had no interest in continuing the conversation. Still, she tried to remain polite, offering a small smile as she nodded. "Well, I won't keep you," she said, taking a step back. "But if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to knock on my door." "Sure," Derek replied, though there was no warmth in his voice. Before Edith could say anything else, Derek gave a curt nod and stepped back inside, closing the door with a soft but final click. Edith stood on the porch for a moment, feeling slightly deflated. She had hoped the interaction would be more welcoming, that she might have had a chance to meet the woman and the children. But Derek's coldness had left her with more questions than answers. As she walked back to her house, Edith couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house had felt off. The way Derek had spoken about his wife and children, so dismissive, so distant, made her uneasy. But what could she do? She was just a neighbor, and it wasn't her place to pry into their lives. That night, as Edith sat in her living room, sipping her evening tea and watching the flickering flames of her fireplace, she heard something strange. At first, it was just a faint thud, like the sound of furniture being moved. But then there was a louder crash, followed by what sounded like muffled shouting. Edith set her teacup down, her heart racing as she strained to hear. The sounds were coming from next door. Edith's pulse quickened as she stood up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The curtains were still drawn at the house next door, and there were no lights on. But the noises continued, more thumping, more shouting, though she couldn't make out any words. Her first instinct was to call someone, maybe the police, but then she hesitated. What if she was overreacting? Maybe they were just having a rough time settling in. Moving could be stressful, especially with children. But the sounds, they didn't sound like the usual chaos of moving. Edith backed away from the window, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't know what to do. She didn't want to interfere, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. For the rest of the night, Edith lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The sounds from next door had stopped, but the unease had settled deep in her chest, refusing to leave. The next morning, Edith woke feeling groggy, her body heavy with exhaustion from the sleepless night. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in her mind. The noises, the shouting, it all pointed to something troubling, something she couldn't ignore. But what could she do? She was just an old woman living alone on a nearly abandoned street. No one would take her concerns seriously. She spent the early hours of the day in her garden, hoping the familiar routine of tending to her flowers would calm her nerves. But even the gentle hum of bees and the soft rustle of leaves couldn't distract her from the gnawing feeling that something was wrong next door. Around midday, as Edith watered her roses, she heard the sound of small footsteps approaching. She looked up and saw the two little girls, Lily and Ivy. She remembered from hearing their mother call to them standing at the edge of her yard. Their wide eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of something else, fear perhaps. Edith smiled softly and waved them over. "Hello, dears," she called, crouching down to their level despite the protest of her aging knees. "How are you today?" Lily, the older of the two, hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Ivy clung to her sister's arm, her gaze darting nervously toward the house. "We're okay," Lily said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We just wanted to see your flowers." "Well, you're always welcome to come and look," Edith said warmly. "I have all kinds of flowers here, roses, marigolds, daisies. Do you have a favorite?" Ivy remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the house, but Lily glanced up at Edith with a shy smile. "I like the roses," she said. Edith's heart swelled with affection for the girls. They reminded her of her younger nieces when they were little, bright, curious, full of life. But there was something off about the way they carried themselves, something subdued and cautious. It wasn't the carefree energy she usually associated with children their age. As they wandered through the garden, Edith kept a close eye on them, noticing how often they glanced back toward the house. It was as if they were afraid someone might call them back at any moment. After a few minutes, Lily paused by a particularly vibrant rose bush, her small fingers lightly brushing the petals. She turned to Edith, her expression serious, and said something that made Edith's blood run cold. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." Edith froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, kneeling beside Lily to look her in the eye. Before Lily could answer, Ivy tugged on her sister's arm, her voice a frantic whisper. "We have to go," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "He'll get mad if we stay too long." Edith opened her mouth to ask more, but at that moment, the sound of the front door slamming echoed across the yard. Edith's head snapped up just in time to see Derek standing on the porch, his arms crossed, his expression dark. "Lily Ivy," he barked, his voice harsh and unforgiving. "Get back here right now." The girls flinched, their small bodies tensing with fear. Without another word, they turned and hurried back toward the house, their heads down, shoulders hunched. Edith watched in stunned silence as Derek grabbed each of them by the arm and led them inside, his grip firm and unyielding. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Edith standing alone in the garden, her heart racing. For a long time she remained frozen in place, the weight of what she had just witnessed settling heavily on her shoulders. The words Lily had spoken echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of dread she hadn't felt in years. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." Edith knew in that moment that something was terribly, terribly wrong, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Edith spent the rest of that day pacing around her small, neatly kept home, her mind racing with a mix of confusion, concern, and fear. She couldn't shake Lily's words, "Our new daddy doesn't like yous," or the image of Derek dragging the girls inside, his face a mask of fury. That scene played on a loop in her mind, and every time she thought about it, her stomach tightened with anxiety. She stood by the kitchen window, absent-mindedly watching the clouds roll in, a sense of foreboding building within her. It had started raining, the light drizzle tapping softly against the window pane, as if mirroring the unease that had settled in her heart. Edith wasn't one to overreact, but this felt different. There was something deeply unsettling about Derek, something that made her instincts scream that the girls weren't safe. She had seen anger before, in all its shades, disagreements, arguments, even Richard losing his temper on occasion. But Derek's anger was something else entirely. It was cold, calculated, and intimidating. The way the girls had flinched at the sound of his voice, the way they'd hurried back inside without a word, had chilled her to the core. Her mind replayed all the small signs she had noticed since the family moved in. Rachel's tired eyes, the way she had looked over her shoulder every time Derek approached, the silence that hung in the air around their house like an invisible curtain. Edith couldn't ignore it anymore. The warning signs were there, but what could she do about it? The rain grew heavier, and Edith found herself retreating into the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would calm her nerves. The familiar act of boiling water, steeping the tea leaves, and pouring the hot liquid into her favorite china cup usually brought her a sense of peace. But tonight, even the comforting warmth of her chamomile tea couldn't quell the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong next door. As she sipped her tea, Edith thought about Rachel. The young mother's face had been drawn with exhaustion the few times Edith had seen her. She looked like someone carrying a heavy burden, someone who was too afraid to ask for help. Edith could relate in a way. After Richard had passed, there had been days when the loneliness felt unbearable. But she had always been too proud to reach out to anyone. She had handled it herself, retreating into her quiet routine, keeping to herself. But Rachel's burden was different. Edith suspected it wasn't just exhaustion from raising two young girls. There was something more. Edith had seen the bruises, faint but noticeable, on Rachel's arms the one time they had exchanged a few words while retrieving the mail. She hadn't said anything at the time, but now those bruises haunted her thoughts. A loud crash of thunder shook the house, and Edith nearly dropped her teacup in surprise. The storm had worsened, and the wind howled against the windows. But it wasn't the storm outside that kept her on edge. It was the storm she felt brewing in that house next door. As she set her teacup down on the counter, another sound broke through the steady drum of the rain shouting. Edith's heart leapt in her chest as she realized the shouting was coming from Derek's house. She moved quickly to the window, her hands trembling as she pulled back the curtain just enough to see. There were no lights on, but she could make out the shadowy figure of Derek standing by the window, his outline stark against the flash of lightning outside. His voice was muffled, but it was clear he was angry. The sound of his shouting grew louder, though Edith couldn't make out the words. She strained her ears, trying to catch any sign of Rachel or the girls, but all she could hear was Derek's furious tone. Suddenly, there was a loud crash like the sound of something being thrown or knocked over. Edith's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to do something, to help, but she was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Should she call the police? Should she go over and check on Rachel? Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. If she called the police and it turned out to be nothing, she would feel like a fool. But if she didn't call and something terrible happened? The shouting continued, followed by another crash. This time, Edith was certain she heard a woman's voice, Rachel's voice pleading, though the words were still muffled by the storm. That was it. Edith couldn't stand by any longer. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking as she pressed the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos in Edith's mind. I'm not sure if it's an emergency, Edith stammered, her voice trembling. It's my neighbors. The man? He's shouting, and I think something might be wrong. I heard a crash, and the woman, she sounded like she was crying. Can you give me the address, Mom? The operator asked. Edith quickly provided the address, her heart pounding in her chest. The operator asked a few more questions, and Edith tried to answer as best she could, but her mind was racing. What if the police came and Derek took his anger out on Rachel and the girls? What if her call made things worse? Well, send officers to check it out, the operator said. Please stay inside your home and don't attempt to intervene. Well, handle it from here. Edith thanked the operator and hung up, her hands still shaking. She stood by the window, watching the house next door, waiting for any sign of movement. The shouting had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Minutes passed, and Edith's anxiety grew with each tick of the clock. She kept glancing out the window, hoping to see the flashing lights of a police car, but the street remained dark and empty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a pair of headlights appeared at the end of the street. Edith's breath caught as a police cruiser slowly pulled up in front of Derek's house. Two officers stepped out, their rain-soaked uniforms glistening in the light from the street lamp. Edith watched as they approached the house, knocking on the door. She held her breath, waiting, hoping that Rachel would answer the door and tell them everything, that she would finally get the help she needed. But instead, it was Derek who answered. Even from her window, Edith could see his body language tense, defensive, as he spoke to the officers. The conversation was brief, and Edith couldn't hear what was being said, but after a few minutes, the officers nodded and returned to their cruiser. Her heart sank as she watched them drive away, the rain still pounding against the windows. Derek had convinced them that everything was fine. No one had been arrested, no one had been helped. The street fell silent once more, and Edith stood by the window, her heart heavy with the knowledge that whatever was happening in that house was far from over. The next morning, Edith felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Had she made things worse by calling the police? She had been so sure that Rachel and the girls needed help, but now she wasn't so sure. Derek had convinced the officers that everything was fine, and they had left without taking any action. What if Derek had taken his anger out on Rachel after they left? What if Rachel had been punished because Edith had tried to help? She paced the living room, wringing her hands, her mind clouded with uncertainty. The weather had cleared, and the sun was shining through the window, casting warm light across the room. But Edith couldn't shake the cold feeling in her chest. She needed to know if Rachel and the girls were okay, but how could she check without making things worse? Knocking on their door might arouse Derek's suspicion, and Edith had no doubt that he would see her as an enemy now. Just as she was contemplating what to do, there was a soft knock on her front door. Edith's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she was too stunned to move. Who could it be? She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she turned the knob and pulled it open. Standing on her porch, looking small and frightened, were Lily and Ivy. The sight of them made Edith's heart lurch. "Girls," Edith said softly, kneeling down to their level. "Are you okay?" Lily glanced over her shoulder nervously, as if she was afraid of being seen. Ivy, who clung to her sister's hand, looked even more scared than she had the day before. "We just wanted to see your flowers again," Lily whispered, though Edith could tell that wasn't the real reason they had come. Edith smiled gently, trying to keep her voice calm. "Of course you can. Come on in, and we'll take a look at the garden together." The girls slipped inside, their movements quick and furtive, as if they were trying to make themselves invisible. Edith led them to the back of the house, where her garden was in full bloom. The girls wandered through the rows of flowers, but their usual curiosity seemed dulled, their movements stiff and anxious. After a few minutes, Edith knelt down beside them, her voice gentle. "What's going on, girls? Is everything all right at home?" Lily looked at her feet, avoiding Edith's gaze. Ivy, who had been quiet the entire time, finally spoke up, her voice barely audible. "Daddy got mad last night. Really mad." Edith's heart ached at the fear in Ivy's voice. "What happened?" Lily swallowed hard, her small hands twisting the hem of her shirt. "He was yelling at Mommy. He threw a chair." He told us to go to our room, but we heard it." Edith closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She had suspected something like this was happening, but hearing it from the girls made it all too real. "Did he hurt your mommy?" Edith asked softly, dreading the answer. Lily hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I heard her cry." Edith's blood ran cold. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand by while Rachel and the girls suffered. "Girls," Edith said, keeping her voice calm and reassuring, "I'm going to help you. But I need to know, are you safe right now? Is your daddy home?" Lily shook her head. "He went to work this morning. Mommy's at home, but she's not feeling good." Edith's mind raced. This was her chance to talk to Rachel without Derek around. Maybe Rachel would finally feel safe enough to ask for help. "All right," Edith said, standing up. "Why don't we go check on your mommy? I'll come with you, and we'll see if she needs anything, okay?" Lily and Ivy exchanged a nervous glance, but after a moment, they both nodded. Edith took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever she might find when they returned to the house. Together, they walked back to the house next door. Edith's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the front door, her hand trembling slightly as she knocked. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Edith thought no one would answer. But then the door creaked open, and Rachel stood there, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and there was a faint bruise on her cheek. "Rachel," Edith said softly, her heart breaking at the sight of her. "Are you okay?" Rachel glanced at the girls, then back at Edith. Her lips trembled, and for a moment it looked as though she might break down. But instead, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." Edith knew she wasn't fine. The bruise, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, it was clear that she was anything but fine. But Edith also knew that Rachel was too afraid to admit the truth. Derek had a hold on her, and until Rachel felt safe, she wouldn't ask for help. But Edith wasn't giving up. Not now. Not after everything she had seen and heard. "Rachel," Edith said gently, stepping closer, "you don't have to go through this alone. If you ever need help, you ever need a place to go, you can come to my house. Anytime." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment, she looked as though she might say something. But then, she quickly blinked them away and gave a small nod. "Thank you, Edith. I appreciate that." Edith could see the fear in Rachel's eyes, the fear of what Derek might do if he found out they were talking. She didn't want to push Rachel too hard, but she needed to let her know that there was a way out. "I mean it, Rachel," Edith said softly. "I'm just next door. If you need anything, day or night, I'll be there." Rachel nodded again, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." The girls, sensing the tension, stood silently by their mother's side. Edith looked down at them, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they were living in fear every day. "I should go," Edith said gently, stepping back toward the porch. "But remember, Rachel, anytime. I'm here." Rachel gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and without another word, she closed the door. Edith stood on the porch for a long moment, her heart aching for Rachel and the girls. She knew things weren't going to get better on their own. Derek wasn't going to change, and Rachel wasn't safe. But Edith wasn't going to give up. She had made a promise to herself and to Rachel, and she was determined to keep it. Edith returned to her house, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. She couldn't believe how bad things had gotten for Rachel, how trapped she seemed. The bruise on her face was a clear sign that Derek's anger had turned physical. And yet, Rachel had still denied needing help. As Edith sat at her kitchen table staring at the phone, she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. What could she do? She had already called the police once, and it hadn't made a difference. Derek had convinced them that everything was fine, and the officers had left without taking any action. If she called again, would the same thing happen? But she couldn't ignore what was happening. She couldn't just sit back and watch as Rachel and the girls suffered. They were in danger, and Edith knew that if she didn't act, things would only get worse. Taking a deep breath, Edith picked up the phone and dialed 911 once more. Her hands were shaking as she pressed the numbers, her heart racing with fear and uncertainty. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through the line. I need to report a domestic situation, Edith said, her voice trembling. It's my neighbors. The man Derek has been violent. I've seen the bruises on his wife, and the children are terrified. Please, I'm begging you send someone to help them. The operator asked for the address and more details about the situation, and Edith tried to explain everything as best she could. She told the operator about the shouting, the crashes, the bruises she had seen on Rachel, and the fear in the girl's eyes. Thank you for reporting this, the operator said after a moment. We take situations like this very seriously. Officers will be dispatched to your location shortly to check on the family. In the meantime, please stay in your home and do not attempt to intervene. Let the officers handle it. Edith thanked the operator and hung up the phone, her hands still trembling. She had done it. She had taken the first step. But now came the waiting, and with it, the fear that Derek would somehow. Edith's heart pounded as she sat in her chair, staring at the phone. She had made the call. She had done what she could, but now all she could do was wait and hope that this time the police would intervene. The silence of the house pressed down on her, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. She hadn't heard any sounds from next door since the girls had returned to their house with Rachel. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. What if Derek came home before the police arrived? What if he found out that Edith had called the authorities again? The weight of her decision gnawed at her, but deep down, Edith knew she had no other choice. Rachel and the girls were in danger. If she hadn't called, she would have regretted it for the rest of her life. The minutes ticked by. Edith stood by the window, peering out from behind the curtains, her breath catching in her throat every time she thought she heard the faint rumble of an engine. Finally, after what felt like hours but had only been 15 minutes, a pair of police cruisers turned onto Cedar Street. Their flashing lights illuminated the otherwise quiet, sleepy neighborhood, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence that had settled over Edith's home. Two officers stepped out of the first cruiser, a tall, middle-aged man and a younger woman with a serious expression. Edith pressed her hand against her chest, trying to calm her racing heart as they walked toward the house next door. She wanted to run outside and tell them everything to make sure they understood the severity of the situation. But she knew she couldn't interfere. They would need to approach the house quietly, carefully. If Derek returned while they were still investigating, things could turn dangerous very quickly. The officers knocked on the door, and Edith held her breath. She could feel the tension in the air, the palpable sense of something about to unfold. She prayed silently that Rachel would answer the door, that she would be brave enough to tell them the truth this time. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Edith saw Rachel standing there. From where she stood at her window, Edith couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Rachel's face pale, her eyes downcast, as she spoke to the officers. The young female officer leaned in slightly, speaking softly, and Rachel glanced over her shoulder, as though she was worried someone might be listening. Edith's heart ached for her. She knew that fear. She could see the internal battle Rachel was fighting, the fear of what might happen if she told the truth, versus the terror of staying in her current situation. The conversation lasted several minutes. At one point, the officers gestured toward the inside of the house, and Edith saw Rachel nod reluctantly. They were going to go inside. Edith felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this time Rachel would let them see the bruises. Perhaps this time they would finally be able to help her. But just as the officers took a step forward, Derek's car pulled into the driveway. Edith's heart plummeted. The tension in the air grew thick, and she could practically feel the fear radiating from Rachel as she turned to look at the car. Derek stepped out, his face hard and unreadable as he took in the scene. His eyes flickered between the officers and Rachel, his expression darkening with each passing second. Edith's hands trembled as she watched, her worst fears playing out before her eyes. Derek approached the porch, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. He looked at the officers, and though Edith couldn't hear the exchange, she could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. His fists were clenched tightly at his sides, and the way he moved, so controlled yet so dangerous, sent a shiver down Edith's spine. The male officer stepped forward, saying something to Derek, but Derek's response was quick, sharp. His eyes darted toward Rachel, and even from across the yard, Edith could see the unspoken threat in his gaze. Rachel shrank back, her shoulders hunching as if she wanted to disappear. The conversation grew more heated, Derek's voice rising slightly as he gestured toward the house. Edith's heart raced as she watched the officers try to maintain control of the situation. The female officer turned her attention back to Rachel, speaking in a calm, measured tone. But it was clear that Derek wasn't going to let them inside without a fight, least not a physical one, but one where his power over Rachel was on full display. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was only a few minutes, the officers stepped back, clearly recognizing that they weren't going to make any progress today. Edith's stomach twisted in knots as she watched them return to their cruiser. Derek stood on the porch, his arms crossed, his eyes following them until they disappeared down the street. Rachel remained frozen in place, her head bowed, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked like a woman on the edge of breaking, but she didn't move, didn't say anything as Derek turned and walked past her into the house. Edith watched, helpless, as the door closed behind them. The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety and unease for Edith. She couldn't stop thinking about the scene she had witnessed, the way Derek had stared down the police officers and silenced Rachel with a single look. The tension at that moment had been so thick that Edith felt it lingering in the air long after the officers left. Rachel hadn't reached out since that day, and Edith hadn't seen the girls in the yard. It felt as though the house next door had gone completely silent. That in itself was unsettling. Edith had grown used to the small sounds, the occasional shout from Derek, the hurried footsteps of the girls running through the house, but now there was nothing. It was a dangerous calm, one that made Edith's stomach twist with unease. She feared that Derek might be punishing Rachel for the police visit, and the thought kept her up at night. Edith knew she had to do something, but what she had already called the police, and nothing had changed. Calling again might only make things worse. She wished there were someone she could talk to, someone who could give her advice on what to do. But Edith had always been a private person, and over the years she had grown more and more isolated from the world. Most of her old friends had either moved away or passed on, and her family, while supportive from afar, wasn't close enough to lean on in situations like this. Her days, once filled with quiet, peaceful routines, were now dominated by worry. She found herself standing by the window, looking out at the house next door, hoping for a glimpse of Rachel or the girls, some sign that they were okay. But the curtains remained drawn, and there was no movement from within. Edith tried to distract herself by tending to her garden, but even the comfort of her roses couldn't ease the tension in her chest. She was constantly on edge, listening to any sound, any clue that things were escalating. It was late in the afternoon on the third day after the police visit when Edith finally heard something. She was in her living room, absent-mindedly folding laundry, when the sound of a door slamming made her jump. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Derek. He was leaving the house, his face set in a hard scowl as he climbed into his car. Edith watched as he backed out of the driveway and sped down the street, disappearing around the corner. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse quickening as she realized what this meant. Derek was gone. For now. Without thinking, Edith grabbed her sweater and rushed outside. Her heart pounded as she approached the house next door, a mixture of fear and determination driving her forward. She knew this might be her only chance to talk to Rachel without Derek looming over them. When she reached the front door, Edith hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and pressed the button. The door opened almost immediately, and Rachel stood there, her face pale and drawn. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and swollen, as though she hadn't slept in days. Her gaze flickered with surprise when she saw Edith standing there, but she quickly stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "Is he gone?" Edith asked quietly as she stepped into the house. Rachel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll be gone for a few hours." Edith closed the door behind her, her heart heavy as she looked around the room. The house was in disarray, furniture knocked over, a vase shattered on the floor. It was clear that Derek had taken his anger out on the house, if not on Rachel herself. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," Edith said softly, her voice filled with genuine concern. "I tried to help. I called the police, but—" "I know," Rachel interrupted, her voice trembling. "I know you did, and I appreciate it. But it didn't work. It never works. He always finds a way to make them leave." Edith's heart ached for her. Rachel sounded so defeated, so resigned to her fate. It was as if she had already given up hope that things would ever get better. "I don't know what to do anymore," Rachel whispered, her hands shaking as she rubbed her arms, as though trying to comfort herself. "I don't know how to get out." "You don't have to stay here," Edith said, stepping forward and placing a hand on Rachel's arm. "There are shelters, places that can help you and the girls. You don't have to live like this." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I've thought about it. So many times. But I'm scared, Edith. I'm scared that if I try to leave, he'll find us. He always does. And he's getting worse." The desperation in Rachel's voice made Edith's stomach twist with fear. She could see how trapped Rachel felt, how much control Derek had over her. He had isolated her, cut her off from any support, and made her believe that there was no way out. "You're not alone," Edith said gently, squeezing Rachel's arm. "You have me, and we can figure this out together. You and the girls can come to my house. We'll call the shelter, and they can help you leave for good." Rachel's tears spilled over, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Edith said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. "You've already shown so much strength, Rachel. You've protected your girls as best as you can, and now it's time to protect yourself, too." Rachel's lip quivered, and for a moment Edith thought she might refuse. But then slowly she nodded. "Okay," Rachel whispered. "Okay. I'll do it." Edith felt a rush of relief wash over her. This was it. This was the moment Rachel had been waiting for, the moment she found the courage to leave. The next few hours passed in a blur as Edith and Rachel hurriedly put together a plan. They knew they didn't have much time. Derek would return soon, and Rachel had to be gone by then. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both, but Edith remained calm and focused. She had to be. There was no room for fear now, not when Rachel and the girls' safety was on the line. Rachel packed a small bag for herself and the girls, only the essentials. They couldn't take much with them, just a few changes of clothes, some toiletries, and a couple of the girls' favorite toys. Everything else would have to stay behind. "I wish we could take more," Rachel said, her voice trembling as she stuffed a few more items into the bag. "But we can't risk getting caught." "It's okay," Edith reassured her. "You'll have everything you need at the shelter. They'll help you get back on your feet." As they worked, Rachel explained more about the shelter she had heard of. It was located in a neighboring town, far enough away that Derek wouldn't be able to track them easily. The shelter had strict confidentiality policies to protect women fleeing abusive situations, and they would provide Rachel and the girls with a safe place to stay until they could find a more permanent solution. Edith was relieved to hear that Rachel had already done some research, that she had a plan in place. But she could also see the fear in Rachel's eyes, the fear of the unknown, of what might happen once they left. "I'm scared," Rachel admitted as she zipped up the bag. "What if he finds us? What if he hurts the girls?" Edith placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "He won't find you. The shelter will make sure of that. And as long as you're there, you'll be safe. You're doing the right thing, Rachel. You're protecting your girls." Rachel wiped away a tear, her hands still trembling. "I just want this to be over. I want to be free." "You will be," Edith said, her heart swelling with empathy. "You're almost there." They worked quickly, gathering everything they needed. Time was running out, and Edith's anxiety grew with each passing minute. Every sound from outside made her jump, fearing that Derek had returned early. Finally, with the bag packed and the girls ready to go, they made their way to Edith's house. The girls clung to Rachel's hands, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the urgency in their mother's movements. At Edith's house, they sat together at the kitchen table while Rachel called the shelter. Her voice hushed and shaky as she explained the situation. The shelter worker on the other end of the line was calm and reassuring, telling Rachel that they would send someone to pick her up as soon as possible. "Just stay where you are," the woman said. "Well, be there in about an hour." Rachel thanked her, her voice trembling with relief as she hung up the phone. "They're coming," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "They're coming to get us." Edith nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. This was it. They were so close to escaping, so close to finally being free from Derek's control. But as the minutes ticked by, Edith couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. They were in a race against time, and Derek's return loomed like a dark cloud over them. All they could do now was wait and hope that help would arrive before it was too late. Edith sat by the window, her eyes trained on the street, her breath shallow as she watched for any sign of movement. Rachel sat at the kitchen table with the girls, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale with fear. The air in the room was thick with tension, the ticking of the clock on the wall echoing in the silence. They had less than an hour before Derek was expected to return. The shelter worker had assured them that the driver would arrive soon, but as the minutes dragged on, Edith's anxiety grew. What if they didn't make it in time? What if Derek came back before they had a chance to leave? The girls sat quietly beside their mother, their small hands gripping hers tightly. They hadn't said much since arriving at Edith's house, but their wide, frightened eyes spoke volumes. Edith's heart ached for them. They were too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but they knew enough to be afraid. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine broke through the stillness of the afternoon. Edith's breath caught in her throat as she peered out the window. Relief flooded through her as she saw a dark blue van pulling up in front of her house. The van bore the logo of the shelter, and a woman stepped out, her face serious but kind as she approached the front door. "They're here," Edith said softly, her voice shaking with relief. Rachel stood up, her legs trembling as she gathered the girls and the small bag they had packed. She took a deep breath, her eyes brimming with tears as she turned to Edith. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Edith smiled gently, though her own eyes were wet with tears. "You're doing the right thing, Rachel. You're going to be okay." Rachel nodded, her lip quivering as she squeezed Edith's hand. Then, with the girls in tow, she made her way to the door where the shelter worker was waiting. But just as Rachel stepped outside, the sound of tires screeching on the pavement made Edith's blood run cold. She looked up in horror as Derek's car came speeding around the corner, pulling into the driveway with a sharp, angry turn. Time seemed to slow as Derek stepped out of the car, his face contorted with fury as he took in the scene before him, the shelter worker, Rachel and the girls, the packed bag. "What the hell is going on?" Derek bellowed, his voice thick with rage. Rachel froze, her eyes wide with terror as she instinctively pulled the girls closer. Edith's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, her mind racing with panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be gone by now. The shelter worker stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, you need to step back. Rachel and the children are leaving with us." "The hell they are," Derek shouted, his fists clenched at his sides. "They're not going anywhere." Rachel stood frozen in place, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as Derek approached, his face twisted with fury. But before he could reach her, the shelter worker stepped between them, her posture firm and protective. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the woman said, her voice steady. "Rachel has made the decision to leave, and you have no right to stop her." Derek's eyes blazed with anger, his fists tightening as he stepped forward, towering over the shelter worker. "You don't tell me what to do," he growled. "She's my wife. Those are my kids. They're not going anywhere." Edith's heart raced as she watched the confrontation unfold. She knew that if things escalated, Derek wouldn't hesitate to use violence. She could see it in the way his body tensed, the way his eyes darkened with rage. But the shelter worker remained calm, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "I'm asking you one more time, sir. Step away or I'll call the police." For a long, tense moment, Derek stood there, his face contorted with anger, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Edith held her breath, praying that he wouldn't lash out, that he would realize he couldn't win this time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Derek's posture shifted. His fists unclenched, and his shoulders slumped slightly. He stepped back, his eyes still burning with fury, but he didn't move to stop Rachel and the girls. "Fine," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "Go. But don't think for a second that you're getting away from me." Rachel flinched at his words, her body trembling as she hurried to the van with the girls. The shelter worker followed, casting one last glance at Derek before climbing into the driver's seat. Edith watched, her heart in her throat, as the van pulled away from the curb, taking Rachel and the girls to safety. Derek stood in the driveway, his face twisted with rage as he watched them leave. When the van disappeared around the corner, Derek turned to look at Edith, his eyes dark and menacing. "You did this," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Edith's blood ran cold, but she refused to back down. "They deserve to be safe," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Derek stared at her for a long moment, his eyes burning with hatred. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed into the house, slamming the door behind him. Edith stood on the porch, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but she knew that it was over. Rachel and the girls were safe. For now. The moment the van disappeared around the corner, Edith finally allowed herself to exhale. She leaned heavily against her front door, her knees trembling as the adrenaline that had kept her steady began to fade. The events of the past hour played on a loop in her mind, Derek's furious shouts, Rachel's terrified eyes, the tense standoff on the porch. It felt like she had just walked out of a nightmare, and the weight of it all left her drained, exhausted, and emotionally spent. But even in her relief, a new fear gripped her heart. Derek wasn't gone. He was still there, next door, simmering with rage, and Edith had no doubt that she had made an enemy of him. His parting words echoed in her mind, his venomous stare seared into her memory. "You did this." The anger in his eyes had been undeniable. Edith had faced many things in her 82 years, loss, grief, loneliness, but nothing had chilled her quite like the look Derek had given her before storming into his house. There had been a darkness there, a fury that made Edith fear for her own safety. Would he retaliate? Would he try to get back at her to help Rachel and the girls escape? Her thoughts swirled as she walked slowly to the kitchen, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. She knew she had done the right thing, she had saved Rachel and the girls from a dangerous man. But that didn't make the fear any less real. Edith set the kettle on the stove, her hands shaking as she prepared a cup of tea, hoping it would help calm her nerves. She had always found comfort in the routine of making tea, the warmth of the cup in her hands, the steam rising gently. But today, even this small comfort couldn't push away the anxiety that gnawed at her. As she sat at the kitchen table staring out the window at the now quiet house next door, Edith's thoughts turned to Rachel and the girls. They were safe now, on their way to the shelter, far from Derek's reach. She imagined them in a quiet room, finally able to breathe, finally able to sleep without fear. The thought brought her a small sense of peace, but it was fleeting. There was still so much to worry about. Would Derek try to find them? Would he follow them to the shelter? What if he found out where they were hiding? Edith knew that shelters were usually discreet, their locations kept secret to protect the women who stayed there. But Derek seemed like the kind of man who wouldn't stop searching. He wouldn't let go of his control that easily. As these thoughts weighed on her, Edith's phone rang, startling her out of her reverie. Her heart leapt into her throat and for a moment she hesitated, fearing the worst. What if it was Derek? What if he had already figured out a way to harass her, even from next door? But when she glanced at the caller ID, her heart softened. It was Rachel. With trembling hands, Edith picked up the phone. "Hello, Edith, it's me," Rachel's voice came through, quiet but steady. There was relief in her tone, but also exhaustion, the weight of everything they had just been through still heavy on her shoulders. "Rachel," Edith said, her voice soft and full of concern. "Are you all right? Are the girls okay?" "We're fine," Rachel assured her, though there was a quiver in her voice that told Edith just how fragile her strength still was. "We made it to the shelter. The girls are asleep now. They were so tired, they fell asleep as soon as we got here." Edith let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The thought of Lily and Ivy, finally safe, finally able to rest, brought tears to her eyes. "I'm so glad," she whispered. "You did it, Rachel. You got out." Rachel was silent for a moment, and Edith could hear her sniffle on the other end of the line. "I couldn't have done it without you," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared, Edith. I didn't think I'd ever have the strength to leave, but you gave me the courage to do it." "Thank you." Edith's chest tightened with emotion. "You were the brave one, Rachel. You did this for yourself and for your girls. I'm just glad I could help." There was another long pause on the other end of the line, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "What if he finds us?" Edith's heart sank. She had been afraid of that question. "He won't," she said firmly, though she knew there was no way to guarantee it. "The shelter will protect you. They know how to keep you safe. But he's so angry, Edith. I've never seen him like that before. I'm scared of what he might do." Rachel's voice cracked, and Edith could hear the fear seeping into every word. Edith's hands tightened around the phone. "Listen to me, Rachel. You did the right thing. You are safe now, and the shelter will help you. Derek can't control you anymore. You are stronger than you know, and no matter what happens, you have people who care about you. You're not alone." Rachel let out a shaky breath, and Edith could tell that her words had brought some measure of comfort, though the fear still lingered. "Thank you," Rachel whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You're going to be okay," Edith said gently. "And if you ever need anything at all, you call me. I'm right here." Rachel promised she would, and after a few more quiet words, they said their goodbyes. Edith hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her kitchen, her heart heavy but hopeful. Rachel and the girls were safe for now, but she knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult for them. Escaping Derek was only the first step. As Edith sipped her tea, she allowed herself a moment to reflect on what had happened. She had spent so much of her life quietly, tending to her garden, keeping to herself, but in the past few days, everything had changed. She had stepped into the middle of someone else's nightmare and helped them escape. And though it had been terrifying, it had also given her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She had made a difference. The next few days passed in a blur of tension and quiet anxiety. Edith tried to go about her normal routine, tending to the garden, making her daily tea, reading by the window, but everything felt different now. The sense of peace that had once filled her small home had been replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. Every time she walked past the window, she found herself glancing toward Derek's house, her stomach tightening with worry. Since that day on the porch, Edith hadn't seen Derek, and that in itself was unsettling. She had expected him to come storming over, pounding on her door, demanding answers. But instead, the house next door had fallen into an eerie silence. Derek's car was still parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of him. It was as though he had retreated into the house, stewing in his anger, waiting for the right moment to strike. Edith knew she couldn't let her guard down. Derek was dangerous. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the way he had looked at her that day. She didn't trust his silence. He was planning something. She was sure of it. On the third morning after Rachel's escape, Edith woke to the sound of a loud bang. Her heart leapt into her throat as she bolted upright in bed, her mind racing with panic. For a moment, she was frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of the noise. Then, another bang, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Edith's blood ran cold. The noise was coming from downstairs. She scrambled out of bed, her hands trembling as she pulled on her robe and hurried to the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tiptoed down the stairs, her mind spinning with fear. What was happening? Had Derek broken into her house? As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Edith's worst fears were confirmed. The front window had been shattered, glass scattered across the floor, and the front door was hanging open. Her hands flew to her mouth, her heart hammering in her chest as she realized what had happened. Derek had been here. Her eyes scanned the room, and that's when she saw a large rock, lying in the middle of the floor, surrounded by shards of glass. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her knees trembling beneath her. The rock was wrapped in a piece of paper, held together by a rubber band. With shaking hands, Edith bent down and picked it up. She carefully unwrapped the paper, her heart pounding in her ears as she unfolded it. The words, scrawled in dark, angry letters, sent a chill down her spine. "You think you can take them away from me? This isn't over." Edith's hands shook as she stared at the note, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Derek had done this. He had broken into her home, her sanctuary, and left this threat behind. He was furious, and now it seemed he was coming for her. She stood frozen in place, her mind spinning with fear and disbelief. This was worse than she had imagined. Derek wasn't going to let Rachel and the girls go not without a fight. And now he had turned his anger toward Edith. Tears welled in her eyes as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had always been so careful, so cautious, but now she was the target of a dangerous man's wrath. She had helped Rachel escape, and now Derek wanted revenge. But Edith wasn't going to let him scare her. She had faced many challenges in her life losing Richard, living alone, the quiet isolation of her later years. But this was different. This was a threat she couldn't ignore. She had to take action. With trembling hands, Edith picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she explained what had happened: the broken window, the rock, the threatening note. The operator assured her that officers would be dispatched immediately, and they instructed her to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait for their arrival. As Edith hung up the phone, her heart was still racing. She moved quickly through the house, locking every door and window. She felt a deep sense of violation in her home. The place that had always been her safe haven had been invaded by Derek's anger. She couldn't let this go. She had to protect herself, just as she had protected Rachel and the girls. By the time the police arrived, Edith had steeled herself. She wasn't going to let Derek win. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. She had seen too many women like Rachel suffer in silence, too afraid to ask for help. Not this time. The officers took photos of the broken window, the rock, and the threatening note. They reassured Edith that they would increase patrols in the neighborhood, keeping an eye on Derek's house and her own. They promised to take the threat seriously, but Edith could tell by the look in their eyes that they knew this was a delicate situation. Derek hadn't made a direct threat of violence, just a menacing warning, but it was enough to make them concerned for Edith's safety. As they left, promising to follow up, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, her hands still shaking. She knew she had done the right thing by calling the police, but the fear lingered, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't over. Derek had made that clear. But Edith wasn't backing down. In the days that followed the break-in, Edith tried to regain a sense of normalcy, but it was difficult. Her home, once a sanctuary, now felt exposed and vulnerable. Every creak, every distant sound outside made her heart race, her nerves constantly on edge. But she refused to give in to the fear. She had to stay strong, not just for herself, but for Rachel and the girls. She had called Rachel to tell her what had happened. The conversation had been difficult, filled with emotion, fear, and guilt. Rachel was devastated to hear that Derek had turned his anger toward Edith. She blamed herself, even though Edith tried to reassure her that it was her fault. "I never wanted this for you," Rachel had said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You've done so much for us, and now he's targeting you. I'm so sorry." "Rachel, this isn't your fault," Edith had said firmly. Derek is the one to blame. Not you.
Not me.
Hes angry because you left, but that's his problem, not ours. Rachel had promised to stay in touch, but Edith could hear the fear in her voice. She knew that Rachel was struggling to adjust to life in the shelter, trying to rebuild her life while keeping one eye over her shoulder, constantly afraid that Derek would find them. In the meantime, Edith wasn't alone. The officers had been true to their word, patrolling the neighborhood more frequently, and Edith had installed new locks on her doors and windows. But despite the added security, the sense of vulnerability lingered. A few days after the break-in, Edith received a surprise visit from someone she hadn't expected, one of her neighbors from down the street, Karen Bellamy. Karen was a bit younger than Edith, in her 70s, and though they had exchanged pleasantries over the years, they had never been particularly close. When Karen knocked on Edith's door, she seemed hesitant, almost nervous, but there was a determined glint in her eye that Edith hadn't seen before. "Edith, I heard about what happened," Karen said, stepping inside the house after Edith invited her in. "The whole neighborhood's been talking. I just wanted to check on you, see how you're holding up." Edith smiled softly, grateful for the unexpected kindness. "I'm managing," she said, though her voice lacked its usual warmth. "It's been difficult, but I'm getting through it." Karen nodded, her face softening with sympathy. "I can't imagine how scary that must have been. That man next door to Ricky always gave me a bad feeling. The way he looked at people, the way he carried himself. I'm not surprised he'd do something like this." Edith raised an eyebrow, surprised by Karen's bluntness. "You noticed it too." Karen nodded. "Oh, absolutely. And you're not the only one who thought so. A few of the other neighbors, Margaret, Nancy, even Bill from across the street, they've all said the same thing. There's something off about him. We've all been worried about Rachel and those girls." Edith felt a pang of relief. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting this battle alone. But hearing that others had noticed the same warning signs made her feel less isolated. "I've been so worried about Rachel," Edith admitted, her voice wavering slightly. "She's at the shelter now, but I don't know what's going to happen. And now that Derek's targeting me, I just don't know what to do." Karen's expression grew serious. "Well, you're not alone, Edith. I want you to know that. None of us on this street want to see you go through this by yourself. In fact, Margaret and I were talking yesterday, and we've come up with a plan." "A plan?" Edith asked, tilting her head in curiosity. Karen smiled, her eyes twinkling with determination. "Yes, a plan. We're going to start a neighborhood watch. Well, keep an eye on each other's houses. Make sure nothing like this happens again. If Derek so much as sets foot near your home, we'll know about it, and we'll call the police immediately." Edith's heart swelled with gratitude. The idea of a neighborhood watch hadn't even occurred to her, but now that Karen had suggested it, it made perfect sense. With more eyes on the street, Derek wouldn't be able to intimidate her or anyone else without being caught. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Edith said, feeling a renewed sense of hope. "Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate it." Karen smiled warmly, reaching out to squeeze Edith's hand. "We're a community, Edith, and we take care of our own. Don't worry, we've got your back." As Karen left, promising to organize a meeting with the other neighbors later in the week, Edith felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in days, she didn't feel so alone. She wasn't facing this battle by herself. She had allies, people who cared about her and were willing to stand by her side. Derek might have thought he could intimidate her, but he was wrong. Edith wasn't going to let fear control her life. She had fought too hard to protect Rachel and the girls, and now she had a whole community behind her, ready to fight back. Together, they would stand strong, and together, they would make sure that Derek couldn't hurt anyone ever again. The days following Karen's visit passed in a blur of activity. The neighborhood watch was officially organized, and soon Edith's quiet street was buzzing with a sense of unity and purpose. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves were now actively involved, checking in on each other, keeping a close eye on the goings-on in the neighborhood, and making sure that Derek had no chance to cause any more trouble. It was a far cry from the lonely, disconnected street that Edith had once known. For the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of community. She felt that they were all in this together, that they could protect each other. And knowing that her neighbors had her back gave Edith a sense of peace she hadn't felt since Rachel and the girls had left. But even with the added security, Edith couldn't shake the feeling that something was still looming like a dark cloud hanging over the street. Derek hadn't made another move since the break-in, but the silence from his house was unnerving. It felt calm before a storm, and Edith had learned to trust her instincts. Derek wasn't done. One late afternoon, as Edith sat in her garden, pruning the last of the roses before the cooler weather set in, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Derek's car had pulled into the driveway next door. He stepped out, looking disheveled, angry. His movements were jerky, erratic, and Edith could see that something was different about him today, something more dangerous. Edith's heart began to race as she watched him stalk toward her house, his expression set in a grim line. This wasn't like the last time. There was no shouting, no dramatic entrance, just a cold, calculated determination in his eyes that made Edith's stomach churn with fear. Before she could even think about retreating into her house, Derek was at her garden gate, his tall frame looming over her like a shadow. "You think you've won?" Derek's voice was low, almost a growl, as he stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you can take them away from me, and I'm just going to let it go?" Edith's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to back down. She had come too far to let him intimidate her now. She straightened her spine, meeting his gaze with steady resolve. "They're not yours to control anymore, Derek," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Rachel and the girls are free from you. You can't hurt them anymore." Derek's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment Edith thought he might lash out. But instead, he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't know what you've done, Edith. You've crossed a line." Edith's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "The only line that's been crossed is yours, Derek. You hurt those girls. You hurt Rachel. And now you're trying to hurt me. But it's over? The police know what you've done. They're watching you. We're all watching you." Derek's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think I care about the police? You think I care about your little neighborhood watch? None of that's going to stop me." Edith's fear deepened, but she knew she couldn't let him see it. She had to stand her ground. "You're wrong, Derek. You're not invincible. You can't bully people into submission forever." Just as Derek's hand twitched toward her, there was a shout from across the street. "Hey, leave her alone!" Edith turned to see Bill, her neighbor from across the street, standing on his front porch, a phone in his hand, his face filled with anger. Behind him, other neighbors had begun to step out of their houses, their eyes fixed on Derek. "You heard her," Bill shouted again, holding up his phone. "The police are on their way, Derek. You've lost." Derek's eyes darted around, realizing for the first time that the entire street was watching him. His bravado faltered, his shoulders tensing as he took in the growing crowd of neighbors, all standing together in a show of solidarity. For a moment, it seemed like Derek might lash out, might do something reckless. But then slowly, the fight drained out of him. His fists unclenched, his shoulders slumped, and with one last look at Edith filled with hatred and resentment, he turned and stormed back to his car. The street was silent as Derek sped away, his tires screeching against the pavement. Edith's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She stood there for a moment, frozen, until Bill crossed the street and stood beside her. "You okay, Edith?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Edith nodded, though her legs still felt shaky. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to all of you." Bill smiled warmly, giving her a reassuring nod. "We're not going to let him hurt you, Edith. Not now, not ever." Edith's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear, they were tears of gratitude. She had been afraid for so long, but now, standing here with her neighbors by her side, she felt a renewed sense of strength. She wasn't alone. In the days following the final confrontation with Derek, the neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the sense of fear that had once gripped Cedar Street began to dissipate. Derek hadn't returned, and Edith had received word from the police that he was being closely monitored. They had issued a restraining order, preventing Derek from coming within a certain distance of Edith's home or the shelter where Rachel and the girls were staying. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give Edith peace of mind for now. Rachel called regularly, checking in to see how Edith was doing and updating her on their progress. The shelter had helped her find legal representation, and she was working towards securing full custody of the girls and filing for divorce from Derek. It was a long, difficult road, but Rachel was determined to keep moving forward. "The girls are adjusting," Rachel said during one phone call, her voice sounding stronger, more confident. "They're starting to sleep better, and we're getting used to our new routine. It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like we're finally free." Edith smiled, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel. She had come so far, and though there were still challenges ahead, Edith knew that Rachel had the strength to face them. "I'm so proud of you," Edith said softly. "You're doing such a good job, Rachel. You and the girls are going to be just fine." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then her voice softened. "We couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You saved us. I'll never be able to thank you enough for everything you've done." Tears welled in Edith's eyes, and she wiped them away with a smile. "You're family now, Rachel, and family takes care of each other." As Edith hung up the phone, a sense of calm settled over her. She had faced her fears, stood up to Derek, and helped Rachel and the girls escape a dangerous situation. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Her home, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. And her neighbors and strangers had become a community, united by a shared sense of purpose. Life on Cedar Street would never be the same again, but that was okay. Because now it is filled with hope, connection, and the promise of a better future. Edith smiled as she stepped out into her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the roses. She knelt down, her hands gently tending to the flowers, feeling the cool earth beneath her fingertips. There was still work to be done, but now she knew she wasn't doing it alone. In the weeks that followed Derek's final confrontation, a new sense of peace settled over Cedar Street. The neighborhood watch remained vigilant, but the need for constant worry had lessened as Derek's presence faded from their lives. He hadn't returned, and the restraining order kept him at a safe distance from Edith's home and from the shelter where Rachel and the girls were living. Edith found herself breathing easier with each passing day, the weight of fear slowly lifting from her shoulders. One crisp autumn morning, as Edith was pruning her roses, she heard the familiar ring of her phone from inside the house. She wiped her hands on her gardening apron and hurried to answer it, her heart lifting when she saw Rachel's name on the caller ID. "Rachel, it's so good to hear from you," Edith said, a smile spreading across her face as she held the phone to her ear. "Hi, Edith," Rachel replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, dear. Just tending to the garden. How are you and the girls doing?" Rachel let out a small sigh, though it was one of relief rather than stress. "We're doing really well, actually. The girls are starting to settle in at school, and they're making new friends. We've been staying at the shelter for a while now, but I've been working with a caseworker. And, well, we found a place. It's a small apartment, but it's ours." Edith's heart swelled with joy at the news. "Rachel, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Edith." "Really? I mean it. You were there for me when I didn't know what to do. I'll never be able to thank you enough." "You've already thanked me more than enough, Rachel," Edith said gently. "I'm just glad you and the girls are safe and moving forward." "We are," Rachel agreed, her voice steady. "We still have some hard days, but we're starting to rebuild. I'm learning how to live without looking over my shoulder all the time. The girls, they've been through so much, but I think they're going to be okay." Edith felt a tear slip down her cheek, and she wiped it away with a smile. "You're an incredible mother, Rachel. You've given them the chance to have a better life, and that's the most important thing." "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I wanted to ask, would you like to come visit us when we're settled into the apartment? The girls miss you, and I'd love for you to see our new place." "I'd love that," Edith replied without hesitation. "I can't wait to see how far you've come." After they said their goodbyes, Edith stood in the quiet of her kitchen, a deep sense of pride and peace settling over her. She had been part of something important, helping Rachel and her daughters escape a dangerous situation and start a new life. Knowing that they were safe and thriving gave Edith a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. But Edith also knew that healing wasn't just for Rachel and the girls. She too had been deeply affected by everything that had happened. For so long, Edith had lived in a world of solitude, wrapped in the memories of her past life with Richard. But now she realized that she had the power to create new connections, to make a difference in the lives of others. Her small, quiet world had expanded in ways she never could have predicted. A few weeks later, Edith stood in front of the door to Rachel's new apartment, her heart racing with anticipation. She held a basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted plant, a housewarming gift for Rachel and the girls. As she knocked on the door, she couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and pride. Rachel had taken such brave steps toward building a new life for herself and her daughters, and Edith was eager to see the progress they had made. The door opened, and there stood Rachel, her face lighting up with a wide smile. "Edith, you made it." "Of course I did," Edith replied warmly, stepping inside and hugging Rachel. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the warmth and light that Edith had come to associate with Rachel. The walls were adorned with colorful artwork, some drawn by Lily and Ivy, and the space felt alive with the energy of a family building something new. Edith smiled as she took it all in, her heart swelling with pride for Rachel's resilience. "Look who's here!" Rachel called out. And moments later, Lily and Ivy came bounding into the room, their faces bright with excitement. "Grandma Edith!" they exclaimed in unison, rushing toward her and wrapping their arms around her. Edith laughed, bending down to hug the girls. "Oh, my dears, it's so good to see you." "We missed you," Ivy said, her voice small but filled with warmth. "Can you stay for dinner?" "I wouldn't dream of leaving before dinner," Edith replied, her heart swelling with affection for the girls. As they settled into the living room, Rachel brought out a pot of tea, and the four of them spent the afternoon catching up, laughing, and sharing stories. The girls proudly showed Edith their artwork, and Rachel talked about how they were adjusting to their new school and making friends. "They're doing so well," Rachel said, her voice filled with relief and pride. "I wasn't sure how they would handle all the changes, but they've been so strong. I'm so proud of them." "You should be proud of yourself too," Edith said gently. "You've created a safe, loving home for them. That's everything." Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. "I still can't believe we made it. There were times when I thought we'd never get out, but now we have a chance at a real life." As the afternoon turned into evening, the conversation grew deeper, and Edith and Rachel found themselves reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. There had been so much pain, fear, and uncertainty, but now there was also hope. They had made it through the storm, and now they were standing on the other side, ready to rebuild their lives. "I never thought I'd feel free," Rachel admitted quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. "But now I wake up every morning knowing that I'm safe, that my girls are safe. And that's everything." Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. "You deserve this peace, Rachel. You and the girls deserve all the happiness in the world." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "And you deserve it too, Edith. You've been through so much yourself. You've given us a new start, and I hope you know how much that means to me." Edith smiled, her heart full. "We've given each other a new start." Later that evening, after dinner, and one last round of hugs from Lily and Ivy, Edith said her goodbyes and made her way back to her own home. As she walked down the quiet street, she felt a deep sense of contentment. Life had changed in ways she never could have predicted, but it was better, now richer, fuller, and filled with new connections. Rachel and the girls had become like family to her, and Edith knew that their bond would only grow stronger as they continued to support one another in the days ahead. As the autumn leaves began to fall and the air turned crisp, Edith found herself spending more time in her garden, reflecting on the past few months. So much had changed, not just for Rachel and the girls, but for Edith as well. Her life, once quiet and isolated, had been transformed by the relationships she had built and the strength she had discovered within herself. But with that transformation came a deeper understanding of the weight she had been carrying for so long: grief, the loneliness, the sense of being left behind. Richard's death had left a hole in Edith's life, one that she had tried to fill with routine and solitude. But now, with Rachel and the girls in her life, Edith realized that she didn't have to carry that weight alone anymore. One afternoon, as Edith sat in the garden with a cup of tea, she found herself thinking about Richard. She missed him every day, missed his laugh, his warmth, the way he had always made her feel safe and loved. But for the first time in a long time, Edith felt a sense of peace when she thought of him, peace in knowing that he would have been proud of her for everything she had done to help Rachel and the girls. As she sipped her tea, Edith decided it was time to visit Richard's grave. She hadn't been in a while, and she felt a strong pull to go to tell him about everything that had happened, about the new life she had found after all these years. The next day, Edith drove to the cemetery where Richard was buried. The drive was quiet, the fall colors painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. When she arrived, Edith made her way to Richard's headstone, a small smile on her face as she placed a bouquet of fresh roses at his grave. "Hello, love," she said softly, her voice filled with affection. "It's been a while, but I've been busy. I have so much to tell you." For the next hour, Edith sat by Richard's grave, telling him about Rachel, about the girls, about everything that had happened since they had moved into the neighborhood. She talked about how she had found new strength within herself, how she had made new friends, and how she had learned that it was never too late to make a difference in someone's life. "I think you'd be proud of me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I've still got a lot of life left to live, and I'm going to make the most of it. I'll carry your love with me, always." As Edith stood to leave, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew that Richard was still with her, in spirit, and that his love would continue to guide her in the days ahead. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the winter holidays approached, Cedar Street came alive with the warm glow of twinkling lights and the festive spirit of the season. Edith, who had once dreaded the long, lonely winter months, now found herself filled with a sense of anticipation and joy. The neighborhood had changed so much in the past few months, and Edith felt more connected to her community than ever before. Rachel and the girls had invited Edith to spend Christmas with them in their new apartment, and Edith had gladly accepted. It was a far cry from the quiet, solitary holidays she had spent in years past, and she was looking forward to celebrating with people she cared about. On Christmas Eve, Edith arrived at Rachel's apartment with a basket full of gifts and homemade treats. The girls greeted her at the door, their faces bright with excitement, and Edith couldn't help but laugh as they pulled her inside. "We've been waiting for you," Lily exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with joy. Mom made hot chocolate. Edith's heart swelled with affection as she followed the girls into the cozy living room where Rachel was waiting with a warm smile. The apartment was decorated with twinkling lights and a small Christmas tree, and the air was filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and pine. "Welcome, Edith," Rachel said, hugging her tightly. "We're so glad you're here." "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Edith replied, her voice full of warmth. As they sat together by the fire, sipping hot chocolate and exchanging stories, Edith felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what she had been missing for so long, a sense of connection, of belonging, of family. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, conversation, and warmth. The girls opened their presents with wide-eyed excitement, and Edith marveled at how far they had come since the dark days of living under Derek's control. They were happy, healthy, and full of life, and Edith knew that Rachel had done an incredible job of creating a safe, loving home for them. Later that night, after the girls had gone to bed, Rachel and Edith sat together by the fire, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. "It feels like a lifetime ago," Rachel said quietly, her eyes focused on the flickering flames. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it out." "But we did." "You did," Edith corrected gently. You found the strength to leave, and now you and the girls have a bright future ahead of you. Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Edith. You were there when I needed someone the most, and I'll never forget that. Edith reached out and took Rachel's hand, squeezing it gently. We've been there for each other, and we'll keep being there, no matter what comes next. As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Edith felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. The storm was over, and now it was time to move forward to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that they had all found the strength to survive and thrive. And in that moment, Edith knew that everything would be all right. Thank you for following along with Edith's emotional and inspiring journey. If you found this story moving or relatable, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. We'll be bringing you more heartwarming tales of resilience, community, and the strength of the human spirit. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you'll always be the first to know when new content is available. We value your feedback, so if you enjoyed this story, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community, and stay tuned for more stories that remind us all that no matter how hard things get, we are never truly alone.